In 1793, France was in the midst of one of the most turbulent periods in its history. The French Revolution, which had begun a few years earlier, had upended the political and social order of the country. The monarchy had been overthrown, and the First French Republic was established in 1792. However, the young republic was far from stable. Internally, it faced significant opposition from Royalists, who sought to restore the monarchy. Externally, France was at war with several European monarchies, including Great Britain, Spain, and Austria, all of whom feared the spread of revolutionary ideals and sought to curb the Republic's influence. This period is often referred to as the French Revolutionary Wars, which were marked by conflict both within France and against foreign powers. The internal instability was fueled by divisions among the French people. Many regions resisted the radical reforms imposed by the government in Paris, leading to armed uprisings. Toulon, a key port city in southern France. The city had a strong Royalist faction, and when they rose up against the Republican government, they sought aid from foreign monarchies. Toulon's strategic importance was undeniable. As the main naval base for France's Mediterranean fleet, its harbor was home to a significant portion of the French Navy. Losing control of Toulon would not only undermine the Republic's naval strength but also open the southern coast of France to invasion. Royalist forces, in cooperation with the British and Spanish, took control of Toulon in August 1793. This move threatened the Republican government, which quickly mobilized forces to recapture the city. Thus, the Siege of Toulon began, a critical conflict that would shape the future of the war and play a significant role in the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. Strategic importance of Toulon. Toulon held immense strategic significance due to its location and role as a military stronghold. Situated on the southern coast of France along the Mediterranean, Toulon was one of the most important ports in Europe at the time. Its natural harbor was deep and well protected, making it an ideal base for naval operations. This geographic position provided access to key maritime routes in the Mediterranean, allowing for the defense of the southern coast of France and the projection of naval power across the region. For the French Republic, Toulon was invaluable. It housed a significant portion of the French Mediterranean fleet, including large ships of the line, essential for maintaining control over the seas. In a time of war, losing this fleet would weaken France's ability to defend its coastlines and disrupt enemy supply lines. Toulon was not just a naval base, but a symbol of France's maritime strength, and its loss would have been a crippling blow to the Republic. The Royalists, on the other hand, saw Toulon as a key asset in their rebellion against the revolutionary government. By seizing the city, they gained control over a major military base and sought to strengthen their position by aligning with foreign monarchies. The Royalist leaders invited the British and Spanish to enter Toulon, knowing that their naval support would fortify the city's defenses against the Republican forces. For Britain and Spain, Toulon represented an opportunity to deal a severe blow to revolutionary France. By controlling the city, they could cripple the French Mediterranean fleet and potentially open a new front against the Republic. The foreign forces supporting the Royalists quickly turned Toulon into a fortified position. British and Spanish fleets took control of the harbor, and defensive measures were strengthened along the city's perimeter. Fortifications were erected on key heights surrounding the city, providing artillery positions that could control the approaches by land and sea. They sought to make Toulon an impregnable bastion, holding off the Republican forces long enough to spark wider unrest and weaken the revolutionary government. The Republican forces understood the significance of recapturing Toulon. Not only was it vital for their naval power, but they also recognized the political and psychological blow that its loss represented. The Republicans quickly mobilized an army to besiege the city, hoping to cut off supplies and reinforcements and force a surrender. The siege would become a key moment in the broader conflict, as both sides recognized the strategic value of this Mediterranean stronghold. Opposing forces, the players at Toulon. The Siege of Toulon brought together a complex mix of forces, each with their own motivations and strategies. On one side were the French Republican forces, determined to reclaim the city and preserve the revolution. On the other side stood the Royalist rebels, who had seized Toulon and allied themselves with several foreign powers, Britain, Spain, Naples, and Piedmont. Each faction contributed to the shaping of the conflict, bringing different tactics and resources to the battlefield. The French Republican forces were largely made up of soldiers loyal to the revolutionary government in Paris. They were driven by the need to suppress internal rebellion and repel external threats. The Republicans were operating under significant pressure, knowing that the fall of Toulon represented not only a military setback but also a political and symbolic defeat. Their forces were composed of both professional soldiers and revolutionary volunteers, many of whom had limited formal military training. Despite this, the Republicans had a strong sense of purpose and were fighting to restore control over the strategically critical city. The Republican commanders relied heavily on traditional siege tactics to overwhelm the defenders. Their approach was to surround Toulon, cutting off supply lines and preventing any reinforcements from reaching the city. They established a series of trenches and gun batteries around the city's defenses, slowly tightening the noose around the Royalists. Artillery played a central role in their strategy, with the Republicans concentrating their fire on key defensive positions. They aimed to breach the outer fortifications, forcing the defenders to fall back and eventually surrender. Throughout the siege, the Republicans were assisted by a rising artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte, whose expertise in positioning and directing the cannons proved decisive. On the opposing side were the Royalist rebels, who had taken control of Toulon and were determined to hold it against the Republican assault. These Royalists were mainly local citizens who opposed the revolutionary government and sought to restore the monarchy. They knew that they could not defend Toulon on their own, so they turned to foreign monarchies for support. In doing so, they essentially handed control of the city to the foreign powers, whose fleets anchored in the harbor. The foreign allies, Britain, Spain, Naples, and Piedmont, quickly moved to reinforce Toulon. Each of these nations had its own interests in seeing revolutionary France weakened. The British Navy, led by Admiral Hood, played a key role in defending the harbor. Their ships blocked the Republican fleet from approaching by sea and provided artillery support from the waters. British forces also assisted in manning the fortifications around the city, particularly on key heights that overlooked the surrounding areas. The Spanish forces were similarly vital in the defense of Toulon. Spanish troops bolstered the ground defenses, working closely with the British to reinforce the city's vulnerable points. Both British and Spanish commanders focused their efforts on holding the forts surrounding Toulon, recognizing that these positions were critical to maintaining control over the city. They knew that if the Republicans captured these forts, they could rain artillery fire on the city and the harbor. Troops from Naples and Piedmont were also present, although in smaller numbers. These forces were integrated into the overall defense strategy, often acting as auxiliary support for the British and Spanish units. Their presence reflected the broader European coalition against revolutionary France, with each monarchy eager to contribute to the defeat of the Republic. While the Royalists and their foreign allies had the advantage of controlling fortified positions and the harbor, they faced significant challenges. The foreign coalition lacked unified leadership, with each nation's commanders pursuing their own objectives. This disunity often hampered their ability to respond quickly to the Republican assault. Additionally, the defenders were heavily reliant on the naval presence in the harbor. If the Republicans could breach the land defenses and bring their artillery to bear on the harbor, the foreign fleets would be forced to withdraw. Both sides employed distinct tactics during the siege. The Royalists and their allies focused on holding strong defensive positions, relying on fortifications and artillery emplacements to fend off the Republican forces. They aimed to stretch the siege out as long as possible, hoping that either the Republicans would be forced to retreat or that additional reinforcements from abroad might arrive. The Republicans, however, had the advantage of being the attacking force. They could dictate the pace of the siege, gradually weakening the defenders through bombardment and attrition. Their use of artillery to target specific defensive points, combined with their slow but steady advances through trench warfare, eventually tipped the balance in their favor. In the end, it was a combination of strategic missteps by the defenders and the relentless pressure from the Republican forces that decided the outcome of the siege. The combatants at Toulon, despite their diverse backgrounds and motivations, were bound together in a struggle that would have far-reaching consequences for the future of France and the course of the Revolutionary Wars. The French Republican forces, numbering around 30,000 men, understood that capturing Toulon would not be possible through a direct assault on the heavily fortified city. The Royalists and their foreign allies had positioned themselves in strong defensive positions, making the city nearly impregnable from a frontal attack. Instead, the Republicans focused on classical siege tactics, aiming to weaken the defenders through a methodical approach. The Republicans constructed a series of trenches and siege lines surrounding Toulon. Trench warfare, which was gaining prominence in this period, allowed the attackers to gradually advance on fortified positions while minimizing their exposure to enemy fire. The trench system provided protection for the troops as they inched closer to the city's outer defenses. Each advance was carefully planned, with soldiers digging trenches under cover of night to avoid being targeted by artillery. These siege lines were not just a means of protection but also served as bases for the placement of artillery. The Republicans deployed around 100 artillery pieces, including 12-pounder cannons and howitzers. The artillery strategy was key to their success. The Republicans placed heavy emphasis on the use of artillery bombardment to soften up the enemy defenses before launching infantry assaults. Under the direction of Napoleon Bonaparte, who was in charge of the artillery, the cannons were placed in positions that could bring overwhelming firepower to bear on critical points in the Royalist defenses. Napoleon recognized the importance of seizing the high ground around Toulon, particularly the forts on the surrounding hills, which controlled the approaches to the city. By taking control of these heights, the Republicans could bring their artillery to bear on both the city and the harbor. The Republicans targeted Fort Ledouillet, a key defensive position that overlooked the city and controlled access to the harbor. Taking this fort would allow the Republicans to position their cannons in a way that threatened both the defenders inside the city and the foreign fleets stationed in the harbor. This was a decisive moment in the siege, as the fall of Fort Ledouillet opened up new opportunities for the Republican forces to pressure the defenders. On the other side, the Royalist and foreign defenders, numbering about 17,000 soldiers, implemented a strategy of defense in depth. They recognized the importance of holding the forts surrounding Toulon, which acted as the city's primary line of defense. These forts were heavily fortified with thick walls and well-placed artillery emplacements. The defenders were equipped with over 200 cannons, including large-caliber guns capable of inflicting significant damage on advancing Republican forces. The foreign fleets, particularly the British and Spanish, also contributed naval artillery to the defense, with ship-mounted cannons occasionally bombarding Republican positions from the harbor. In addition to the defensive positions on land, the defenders implemented a naval blockade. The British and Spanish fleets controlled the entrance to Toulon's harbor, preventing the Republican Navy from launching an attack by sea. This blockade also served to protect the Royalist-controlled city from any potential amphibious assault and ensured that the defenders could be resupplied from the sea. Despite their strong defensive positions, the defenders faced significant challenges. They were heavily reliant on their ability to hold the forts and maintain control over the harbor. The Republican artillery, however, began to take a toll on these fortifications. Once the Republicans seized the high ground and established artillery positions that could directly target the harbor, the situation for the defenders became critical. The threat to the ships in the harbor forced the foreign fleets to consider withdrawing, as staying meant exposing their vessels to devastating artillery fire. As the siege progressed, trench warfare continued to play a crucial role. The Republicans dug closer and closer to the city's defenses, each trench bringing them within striking distance of the outer walls. These trenches also allowed the Republicans to mount night assaults and launch probing attacks on weak points in the enemy lines. The defenders, aware of the constant danger posed by these trenches, tried to launch sorties to disrupt the digging and destroy the advancing siege works. However, these sorties often failed to inflict lasting damage, and the Republican advance remained steady. Throughout the siege, both sides experienced heavy casualties. The Republican forces suffered around 3,000 casualties, while the Royalists and their foreign allies lost approximately 2,000. Despite their smaller numbers, the defenders were at a disadvantage as their ability to resupply dwindled. The foreign fleets, recognizing that they could no longer protect the harbor, began to withdraw, leaving the Royalist forces on land to face the Republican assault alone. In the final stages of the siege, the Republicans used their artillery to full effect, bombarding the remaining defensive positions and wearing down the defenders' morale. The relentless artillery fire, combined with the pressure from the advancing trenches, eventually forced the defenders to abandon their positions. The fall of the forts surrounding Toulon marked the beginning of the end for the Royalist and foreign defenders. Without the ability to hold these critical positions, the city became vulnerable to a final assault. Ultimately, the siege was a victory for the Republican forces, largely due to their effective use of artillery and siege tactics. The combination of trench warfare, careful placement of artillery, and the gradual tightening of the siege lines allowed them to overcome the well-fortified city and its defenders. Toulon fell after months of intense fighting, marking a crucial turning point in the Revolutionary Wars and cementing the importance of siege tactics in the warfare of the era. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. The Siege of Toulon marked a pivotal moment in the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, a young and relatively unknown artillery officer at the time. His role during the siege showcased not only his military acumen but also the strategic thinking that would come to define his career. Although the Republicans were determined to retake the city from Royalist forces and their foreign allies, it was Napoleon's decisive intervention that turned the tide in their favor. Napoleon was initially appointed to oversee artillery operations, a position that allowed him to display his expertise in siege tactics. Toulon presented a complex battlefield, as it was a heavily fortified city, supported by British and Spanish fleets in the harbor. The challenge for the French Republican forces was not just to breach the city's defenses but to break the naval blockade that gave the Royalists a strategic advantage. The besieging army had struggled in its initial efforts due to ineffective leadership and the difficult terrain, which included hills, forts, and coastal defenses. Napoleon immediately recognized that the key to victory lay in gaining control of two specific points, the heights overlooking the harbor and Fort l'Aiguillette. The fort, situated on a strategic hill known as l'Aiguillette, controlled access to the harbor and, if captured, could prevent the British fleet from holding its position. With this in mind, Napoleon reorganized the artillery, concentrating his firepower on these critical areas. His plan involved precise artillery bombardment, designed to weaken the defenses before launching a direct assault. The siege tactics used by Napoleon relied heavily on the effective positioning and use of artillery. He advocated for the placement of heavy guns in positions where they could inflict maximum damage on enemy fortifications. His leadership led to the establishment of new batteries, closer to the enemy, which dramatically increased the effectiveness of the Republican bombardment. By focusing fire on the Royalist-controlled forts and disrupting their supply lines, Napoleon was able to slowly wear down their defenses. On the other side, the Royalists and their foreign allies were well entrenched. The British, in particular, played a significant role in defending the city's harbor and maintaining the naval blockade. Their tactics included strengthening the city's fortifications and using the fleet to resupply and support the defenders. However, their reliance on holding Fort l'Aiguillette and the surrounding heights became their undoing, as Napoleon's relentless artillery fire made these positions increasingly untenable. The turning point came when Napoleon, having successfully concentrated fire on Fort l'Aiguillette, recommended an assault on the position. In a coordinated attack, Republican forces, bolstered by artillery support, overran the fort, forcing the British fleet to withdraw from the harbor. With the naval blockade broken and the fortifications in disarray, the Royalist resistance collapsed, and the city fell soon after. Napoleon's role in the Siege of Toulon was widely recognized as a key factor in the Republican victory. His innovative use of artillery and understanding of siege warfare earned him praise from senior commanders and led to his promotion to brigadier general at the age of 24. This victory not only marked the beginning of his rapid rise through the military ranks but also demonstrated his tactical brilliance, which would later define his larger campaigns across Europe. Fall of Toulon and aftermath. The fall of Toulon marked the climactic end to a fierce and complex siege that tested the resolve of both the besieged Royalists and the attacking Republican forces. The final phase of the siege was a desperate struggle, with each side using distinct tactics to either defend or seize the vital port city. As the Republican army closed in on Toulon, they intensified their artillery bombardment, focusing on key defensive positions around the city. Led by the young artillery officer Napoleon Bonaparte, the Republicans employed carefully calculated cannon fire to weaken the Royalist fortifications. Bonaparte's strategy centered on capturing Fort Mulgrave and Fort l'Etoilette, which commanded the harbor. From these elevated positions, the Republican forces could direct their artillery toward the British fleet and the inner defenses of the city. The systematic bombardment of these forts, along with well-coordinated infantry assaults, eventually breached the Royalist defenses. The Royalists and their foreign allies, British, Spanish, Neapolitan, and Piedmontese forces, realized the gravity of their situation as Republican forces gained ground. In response, they shifted to a defensive posture, fortifying their positions and focusing on delaying the inevitable Republican advance. Their defensive efforts, however, were strained by conflicting command structures and differing objectives among the Allied forces. The Royalists were fighting to preserve Toulon as a safe haven for anti-revolutionary forces, while the British and Spanish were primarily interested in preventing the Republicans from capturing the French Mediterranean fleet. As the Republicans seized key strongholds, it became clear that the fall of Toulon was imminent. In a last-ditch effort, the Royalists and their foreign allies decided to destroy the French fleet docked in the harbor to prevent it from falling into Republican hands. The destruction of this fleet was a blow to France's naval power, but the tactical decision was seen as a necessary sacrifice to deny the Republicans control over such a critical asset. When the Republicans finally entered the city, chaos erupted. Many of Toulon's citizens had supported the Royalists, and in the aftermath of the Republican victory, they faced brutal reprisals. Revolutionary tribunals were established, and many were executed or imprisoned for their role in the rebellion. The foreign forces evacuated under heavy fire, leaving the Royalists and their supporters to face the wrath of the victorious Republicans. The fall of Toulon had significant repercussions for the course of the French Revolutionary Wars. While the destruction of the fleet was a temporary setback for France's naval ambitions, the victory consolidated Republican control in southern France and marked a turning point in the war. Toulon's recapture not only cemented the Republic's hold on the Mediterranean but also served as a crucial moment in the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, whose role in the siege brought him to the attention of senior military leaders. In the aftermath, Toulon was left devastated by the fighting and the political purges that followed. The city's recovery would take time, but the siege remains a defining moment in French military history. It underscored the intensity of the internal divisions within France during the Revolution and the lengths to which the Republic would go to suppress dissent and secure its borders. Impact on the French Revolutionary Wars. The Siege of Toulon had a profound impact on the French Revolutionary Wars, shaping the course of future military campaigns and altering the balance of power in the Mediterranean. It was not just a singular event, but a moment of transformation that demonstrated the tactical resilience of the French Republic, while also signaling the emergence of new military leadership, most notably in the figure of Napoleon Bonaparte. Tactically, the siege highlighted the adaptability and determination of the Republican forces. Initially outgunned and facing a coalition of Royalists and foreign powers, including the British and Spanish, the Republicans adopted siege tactics that involved both trench warfare and concentrated artillery fire. Napoleon, then a young artillery officer, played a pivotal role by organizing and directing the placement of artillery that eventually led to the capture of strategic points like Fort L'Aiguillette. This was a critical moment in the siege because it allowed the Republicans to command the harbor and effectively cut off the Royalist and Allied forces from reinforcements. On the opposing side, the Royalists and their allies attempted to use their superior naval power to maintain control of Toulon's harbor. The British, in particular, sought to defend their position through a combination of naval blockades and fortifications around key points in the city. However, their reliance on traditional defense strategies and their failure to disrupt the steady encroachment of the Republican siege operations proved fatal. As the Republicans tightened their grip on the city, the foreign fleets were forced to withdraw, and in their retreat, they scuttled a significant portion of the French Mediterranean fleet, a desperate move that revealed their complete loss of control. The long-term consequences of this victory were significant. The recapture of Toulon not only safeguarded one of France's most vital naval bases but also secured the Republican government's hold on the south of France. It dealt a severe blow to the Royalist cause within the country, weakening internal opposition. Internationally, the victory was a signal that the French Republic was a force capable of repelling foreign intervention, a message that would resonate throughout Europe. In the Mediterranean, the fall of Toulon had an immediate effect on naval strategy. The destruction of the fleet crippled France's naval presence in the region, but it also galvanized the Republic to rebuild and restructure its naval forces. In the years following the siege, the Mediterranean became a critical theater of war, with both French and British forces vying for control. Toulon's recapture allowed the French to begin launching more effective naval operations, setting the stage for future engagements such as the campaigns in Egypt and Italy. Perhaps most significantly, the siege marked the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. His tactical brilliance in Toulon did not go unnoticed by the French military leadership, and it was from this point that his rapid ascent through the ranks began. Toulon was the first step in a career that would see him dominate European warfare for the next 2 decades. The siege showed how the French revolutionary military, which was often seen as chaotic and disorganized, could achieve decisive victories when employing new strategies and capable leadership. The Republican victory at Toulon had far-reaching consequences. It secured the Mediterranean coastline for the French Republic, disrupted Royalist and foreign efforts to destabilize the revolution, and set the stage for France's military resurgence in the region. Moreover, it introduced the world to Napoleon Bonaparte, whose influence would shape not only the course of the Revolutionary Wars but also the future of European history. The siege was a turning point, one that demonstrated the resilience of revolutionary France and its ability to overcome both internal rebellion and external threats. Legacy of the Siege of Toulon. The Siege of Toulon left a profound legacy in military history, particularly in how it shaped future strategies, military careers, and warfare in Europe. One of the most significant aspects of this legacy is the role the siege played in developing siege tactics and its influence on European military doctrine. The battle also marked the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, whose involvement in Toulon would launch his career, ultimately changing the course of European history. At its core, the Siege of Toulon was a tactical engagement defined by the effective use of artillery. Napoleon's innovative positioning of cannons and his understanding of artillery's central role in siege warfare led to decisive breakthroughs for the French Republic. His use of elevated ground to bombard key positions like the British-held forts was a notable departure from the conventional tactics employed by both sides. By focusing fire on the heights surrounding Toulon, Napoleon crippled the defensive capabilities of the Allied forces. His emphasis on concentrated artillery barrages to clear entrenched positions became a foundational element of siege tactics, setting a precedent for the use of heavy artillery in future European conflicts. From the defending side, the Royalist and Allied forces initially relied on the traditional defensive measures of entrenchment and fortifications, aimed at holding strategic points across Toulon. The Royalist commanders, supported by British and Spanish naval forces, tried to fortify key positions and control access to the port, with the hope of holding out long enough for reinforcements. Their use of naval superiority also played a significant role in the early stages of the siege, allowing them to maintain supply lines and reinforce certain defensive strongholds. However, their failure to adequately predict the Republican artillery's impact proved disastrous. Napoleon's decision to prioritize the recapture of the forts overlooking Toulon's harbor shifted the balance in favor of the Republican forces. Once these positions fell, the Royalists and their allies were forced to retreat under heavy bombardment, leading to the abandonment of the city. The destruction of the French fleet by retreating Royalist forces was a tactical retreat meant to prevent the Republican army from gaining control of critical naval assets. Though this action effectively denied the French Navy its Mediterranean fleet, it underscored the decisive nature of siege warfare, where control of high ground and key artillery positions could determine the outcome. In a broader sense, the Siege of Toulon also laid the groundwork for future siege operations, particularly in the Napoleonic era. It demonstrated the importance of artillery superiority and the use of terrain to dominate the battlefield. Commanders in later European wars, including Napoleon himself, would adopt similar strategies, focusing on the systematic bombardment of fortified positions before launching a full-scale assault. The siege showed that even well-entrenched positions could be overcome with superior firepower and tactical foresight, a lesson that would be applied in major campaigns across Europe in the years to come. Finally, the Siege of Toulon is often remembered for Napoleon Bonaparte's emergence as a military leader. His role in securing the Republican victory not only elevated him within the ranks of the army but also placed him in the national spotlight. Toulon became a defining moment for Napoleon, showcasing his ability to combine innovative military tactics with strategic insight. His swift rise from a relatively unknown artillery officer to a celebrated hero of the Republic can be traced back to this battle. It was here that he began to cultivate his reputation as a brilliant strategist, a reputation that would later see him ascend to the heights of power in France and reshape the European continent through his campaigns. On the whole, the legacy of the Siege of Toulon lies in its tactical innovations, its impact on siege warfare, and the meteoric rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. The lessons learned from this siege influenced European military thought for decades and provided a glimpse of the transformational role Napoleon would play in future conflicts.